Yo, so today I'm going to be breaking down a hard melody for someone like Yeat or Can and then throwing some Zay Skills type drums on it at the end. Alright, so for the first sounds in the melody, it's actually two that get combined and rendered together. So the first one is a lead called Helicopter from the Psycho one-shot kit, and then the second one is a synth called Mr. Rage from the Hypnosis Bank. And I also changed this a bit and I turned it to mono and then turned the port time to always and turned it up a little bit. So it's basically like a lead instead of a synth. Alright, and then here's the MIDI for the Mr. Rage synth. And overall it's super simple, and like a lot of my other hyperpop melodies, it's just a 2-bar pattern that repeats the rest of the time. And I'm not going to go ahead and remake this from scratch just because of how simple it is, but I basically figured out the bass notes being D sharp, A sharp, and then A sharp again down an octave, and then layered it with these top notes that are all next to each other in the scale. And I mentioned this in pretty much all my videos, but if you use the notes next to each other in the scale, so if you're in D sharp, that would be B, A sharp, F sharp, and F, it kind of gives off a more dark or eerie feel. So when you combine it with these harder synths, it kind of sounds really dark and aggressive. And then like I mentioned before, that 2-bar pattern just repeats for the rest of the time, so there's really nothing else to mention for this MIDI. And then here's the MIDI for the Helicopter lead, and again, it follows like the same pattern as the last one, where it is a 2-bar pattern and it kind of sticks to all the notes that are next to each other in the scale, as you can see. But for this one, I just did slide octave notes, so it's super like over exaggerated and just sounds kind of wonky. So I broke it up with these little chops just to make it a little bit more interesting and overall give it a tiny bit of room to breathe. But overall, again, like the last pattern, it's super simple and it's just this 2 bars that repeats for the rest of the time. And then for the effects on both of those, I routed it through Shaperbox, which is on the same wave preset, which comes free with Shaperbox, halftime on the 1-bar preset, an EQ just to cut all the lows and then cut out a little bit of the highs, and then finally an imager just to make it feel a little bit more mono. And I actually ended up rendering this out 3 times for some variation. So one of the renders has the halftime mix at 0, one is at 50, and then one is at 100. So that's where a lot of the variation comes in the melody, and it's just a really easy way to do it. So like I just mentioned, I have 3 different versions. So this is the one with 50%, this is the one with 100%, and this is the one with 0. And on the one with 0, I went ahead and chopped it up and then added a gross beat gate, and the gross beat preset is on half beat gate. But I just kind of did this so it has a little bit of room to breathe, because it got a little bit squeaky when it was still at like 0% halftime, so there was nothing going on to lower it. So I just went ahead and added this chop and then the gate to just make it a little bit more interesting and more listenable. So after all those effects and rendering it out 3 times, here's what it sounds like. So overall, those 2 sounds just kind of make a great base for the rest of the melody to build on. So then for the next sound, it's a lead called Exceed, again from the Psycho one-shot kit by Sunboy. Pretty much all the sounds in this video are by Sunboy, so you should definitely go check out his kits. Alright, and then here's the MIDI for that. So again, it's super simple and it just copies the root notes of the first MIDI. And I just kind of did this to sit in the background and kind of like let you know the chord is starting when you're like doing an 808 or something. I just find if you put Shaperbox on something, sometimes you lose like the start of the chord and it gets kind of all mixed up. So I just add this in so it'll be easier for me later. And then for the effects on that, I just have an EQ to boost the mids and cut out of the highs, an EQ to completely cut the lows, and then finally an imager just to make it feel really wide. So after adding those effects, here's what it sounds like. Alright, so then for the next sound, it's a bell called Yeat Bell 1, and I went ahead and found this on Reddit in some Yeat drum kit, and overall it's a pretty solid sounding bell, so I've been using it in a lot of my melodies. And then here's the MIDI for this, and again, super simple. This time it's just a 4-bar pattern that repeats, but this just layers with the root notes of the chord being A sharp and D sharp, and I only have it hitting here just because it's kind of spaced out, and I felt if it was hitting like all the time in different places, it would be a little bit too much, but just here is good enough, and it sounds alright. And then for the effects on that, I just have reverb on the default preset, an EQ to boost the highs and the mids, another EQ just to cut out all the lows, and then this pancake preset that I made myself, so the 2 A sharp notes hit in different ears, and then the D sharp note is right down the middle, so it's just kind of a little bit more interesting. So after those effects, here's what it ends up sounding like. Alright, and then the next sound is a lead called Menace from, again, that Psycho one-shot kit, and overall it's just a good sounding lead to make some simple patterns with. Alright, so then here's the MIDI for this, and again it's a super simple pattern, just using the notes next to each other on a scale, and this is pretty much the same pattern that's in Money So Big, but I ended up adding these little fast rolls, and this is one of the reasons that I really like to use one-shots for these type of beats, because you can do velocity controls, so this ends up sounding really glitchy once you have it sweep down really fast and then sweep up with the velocity, and how you get those even sweeps is selecting the notes you want and then right click and dragging so it's all nice and even. And then for the second half it's the exact same, but I pitched it up 5 and then down an octave, and then these notes were originally right here, so I just brought them up to fit back in the scale at the F sharp and F. And then I didn't end up adding any effects on this, so here's what it sounds like. Alright, and then for the last sound besides the basses, it's the futuristic trip pluck from, again, the Psycho one-shot kit. I use that kit for pretty much every sound in this video, but this just plays a super simple accent pattern. So here's the MIDI for this, and like I do in a bunch of my videos, I like to have like a pluck or a bell layering where the claps would be, but in my case I did more of a pop clap pattern like I've done in the past, but this just kind of sits in the background when the melody is a little bit more chill and there really isn't much going on, and it kind of stands out then. And then again on the mixer for that I have nothing, so here's what it sounds like. So it's just a super simple pattern that kind of stands out when there's nothing else going on in the melody. Alright, and then for the final two sounds in the melody, they're both basses and they kind of get mixed together. So the first one is a lead called Deep I made in Serum. So it's pretty much that same saw wave bass that I've shown how to make in the past. But the difference with this one is I went ahead and made it mono and legato and then automated the velocity to control the filter. So it's kind of like you can get some weird variation, like having the filter be in different places. And then for the second one, it's a bass that I've used in a lot of my other videos, but it's a bass called Before from the Stardust Serum Bank. Overall, these two basses just combine really nicely together, and that one I made just sounds really cool. So here's the MIDI for the deep bass, and as you can see, it just follows the root notes, but I have it offset a little bit because this is right where the other bass plays, so they kind of switch back and forth. The other one being a little bit softer and more of a sub bass, and this one being super aggressive with the filter automations and everything. And then at the end, I have this little chop roll where the velocity goes kind of crazy, and that sounds pretty cool in the end. And then here's the MIDI for the before bass, and like I mentioned before, it kind of hits wherever the other one isn't, and they kind of swap back and forth. So if you remember from the last MIDI, it hit right here, and then I believe it was hitting here and here as well. So that kind of bounced back and forth, and it's just overall a cool sound to try out in your melodies. And then for the effects on those, on the deep bass, I just have a low cut so I can automate this to come on when the drums are on, so it doesn't interfere with the 808. And then for the before bass, I have this plugin called Temper, which is just a free distortion plugin to make it sound a little bit more aggressive. So after all those effects, here's what it ends up sounding like. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the melody, and I ended up pitching it down one in the end. For whatever reason, pitching it down one always kind of gives it more of a dark feel, so I like to do it with these hyperpop melodies and the dark melodies as well. But here's what everything sounds like all together. So overall, I think the melody actually got a little bit too busy, so I think I'm gonna have to take some stuff out when I do the drums. But now we can get started on the drums. that's gonna be pretty much it for the video. I like the way the drums turned out. Overall, the beat is just like super busy. But thank you for watching. I really don't know what's happening with the camera because like if I put my hand there, usually it like darkens it, but it's like almost black. So I'm a little bit confused. I gotta figure that out for the next video. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. Have a splendid rest of your night and bye.